Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about Canadian history and literature and cultural artifacts in general, and every once in a while have on lovely authors from Canada to talk about their works. And today we have a special guest, certainly a kind of author that we've not had on the show before. Right? Our guest is a writer, a documentary journalist, a film historian. And when she's not writing books on film history or journalism, she also appears on CBC Radio and has appeared on the European Culture Channel, Art. And here today to talk about film history in Canada and Indigenous involvement in this under-discussed topic, I think, is Mary Graham with her new book, A Stunning Backdrop, Alberta in the Movies, 1917 to 1960. Welcome to the show.
Hi, and thank you.
So getting into it, how would you describe your book for a person who has no awareness of it and who's just coming into this fresh?
That's been really hard to pin down. I would say it's an ultra-visual exploration of early filmmaking in Alberta through more than 150 set stills and archival photographs, and about 30 original photographs by some of the best photographers in Canada of filming locations, some of them 100 years old. But it's also a definitive history that establishes why Alberta is such an iconic filming location. And it also recaptures lost history through local stories, Hollywood perspectives on filming here. And it records the unrecognized involvement of First Nations and their importance to the film industry.
I think that was one of the things that struck me the most, right, is just how different this book was from most film histories that I've read before, which tend to take a very, glam and glitzy look on, for example, Hollywood stars or anything like that. But you delve into incredible detail, right? And as you're saying, the local aspect of it and the First Nations aspect of it really impressed me of like how much detail and the interest that you clearly have for this subject. It was extremely interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I'm curious, speaking of highly specific topics, why, or how I should say, did you become interested in this particular topic in the first place?
It started as a coffee table book on Alberta quote unquote movie landscapes, loosely based on the very popular Kauai movie book, a publication that's been in print for decades. You can get it in Costco, you can get it in doctor's office. You can usually not get it. It's hard to get. And I approached the film commissioner in the province, and we sort of nailed down a concept. But that concept changed as my research grew, and as I began to realize the magnitude of the history and who was involved, and also that it had not been understood or recognized or put together before.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And for readers who might not have a copy of the book yet because it's not released yet, it's like 400 pages long, the book. It's a dense tome. So when we're talking about needing to contextualize or to be concise with these answers, it is an extremely difficult task. So, and you clearly, go on you cover a broad range of things. And I think absolutely that's something that needs to be talked about. And it's one of those books that as I was reading through the advanced copy of it I never realized that I would be so interested in this topic until I read it. And then I was like, well, of course, where has this book been the entire time? Right. And that's one of the first things that I thought of was like, this is something that I never thought I needed as much as I needed it when I read it. And very, very cool.
Conventional histories are usually done through, especially going back 100 years. So the record is basically studio publicity. And even 100 years ago, they would put those stories out and then they would run all over North America and they'd be accepted as history. Right. And also sort of myths that have been handed down for 100 years. So there was a lot of getting through all that nonsense to getting to what actually. I was really lucky in Alberta because the White Museum and the Jasper Museum had recorded, personal experiences of locals. And then there was a lot of news stories. And so you had Hollywood's sort of experiences and local experiences, and they weren't always congruent.
Sure.
But,
Sure. I'm sure we'll get into that, but yeah. But I'm curious, was because the book covers all the way to 1960, and I'm curious, as you mentioned that there were recordings of people who were involved in this. Did you have a chance to talk to people firsthand who were there at the time, or has that kind of is that no longer a possibility?
I did. I managed to talk to two or three people who were there. It's amazing when you actually do talk to people how much the history changes. There was a Calgary woman who met Marilyn Monroe while she was pregnant on the
Wow.
riverbank. And there was a gentleman in Faust, Alberta, who James Oliver Curwood had actually summered there, but that's not known. And that's why they filmed Back to God's Country there. So, and he also knew a lot about the locals who worked on the set and worked. It was very cold that year. So yeah, I wouldn't have had that if I hadn't. It was, yeah, yes, I did.
um, so I'm curious, did you have any assumptions about what you would find before going into this topic? And if so, how did this change as the work took the shape that it currently has?
What I encountered is that most people thought most of the movies made in the early years in Alberta were akin to B westerns or second-rate, low-budget movies.
Mm-hmm.
But I began to realize these were extremely important directors and cinematographers making movies very early in their careers. Nothing had been done on it because there really wasn't that much material available on those early years, and that took me years to get to. It took a lot of research. And how did it change? It all changed. Number one, when I started working with the Nakota, and also when I began to look at the connections between directors and their movies, and I found a gold mine of movies made by early pioneers, those young hot shots, who were there when the motion picture industry began.
Right.
Most of them came up in the industry together. They were all very connected, like John Ford, Thomas Ince, Raoul Welch, Frank Borzage, Reginald Barker, Herbert Brennan, almost every director who made a movie in Alberta, and the list is impressive when you look at it, except Ernest Lubitsch and Billy Wilder and a couple of British directors, the Archers. They were all connected in 1913. John Ford was a protege of Thomas Ince. So that sort of opened it up the topic for me. And then I began to look for connections to modern day filmmakers because when I first saw Days of Heaven, it was my first impression was that Malick had made it as an ode to those early pioneers and to the who came to Alberta to capture realism for the Nor'westers. And I thought, well, no, that couldn't be. But I was just in the Oscars archives in LA researching my second book on Alberta and film after 1960. And I read his scripts for the movie, and it was confirmed for me. It was actually, he actually wrote the magic hour into the script as well, but it was very obviously, it was an homage to those early pioneers. And the other thing I discovered, his cinematographer talks about the blue light of magic hours so unique to Alberta. And Dr. Zhivago was shot here, a couple scenes at Morley and possibly Lake Louise. And when I looked at the movie and looked at the research, it's that same blue light at that same hour. And David Lean and his cinematographer, Freddie Young, had worked with the Stoney Nakoda in Banff, but they were probably out at Morley when they were very, very young. It was the first movie they worked on together in 1940. But a lot of the times when the cinematographers came here, they spent if they weren't working, they were roaming, particularly the Canadian Rockies, taking shots and testing things. So, just seeing those kind of connections and the fact that David Lean knew about that light. So, yeah.
It's very interesting because the assumption that one would have, right, is that, okay, or at least the assumption that I had is like, okay, Alberta was used as your title indicates, right, a stunning backdrop, something that you could shoot a Western against or anything like that. But it goes so much deeper into film history in a way that people don't necessarily think about when thinking about modern movie making, right? And that a lot of these authors who, we admire today, these filmmakers, I should say, who we admire today would have seen those movies. And it's all connected in a way that people don't necessarily, I think, give filmmakers enough credit for. And I think, that's a very interesting point to raise. I'm just thinking what an amazing moment that would have been in history to be there as all of these directors are filming in Alberta. And yeah, how impressive that must have been to see all of them kind of working together. Wow.
Yeah, no, it's never been boring. It's been constantly. I mean,
Yes.
the second book is I'm just overwhelmed right now with the second book too. It's too much. Like slow, get back to being boring, guys. No, it's a fantastic history, but
So we mentioned briefly that you have a bit of a journalism background, and I'm curious how this impacted your approach to film history, because those two are not necessarily related, but they can be. And I'm curious if there is a kind of relation that, or at least some kind of experience as a journalist that you brought to this book.
absolutely. I mean, a lot of this research was when you're going back 100 years, you find things like I'm pretty sure there's about 20 at least more movies, probably by some of the big directors again, that will never, and with digitalization of material, it's easier, but um, you get these hunches when you see photographs, or you a lot of times when they talked about filming in Alberta, they called it the Great Northwest, and they would
Mm,
say it's 1,500 miles north of Montreal, northwest. And so I looked at it on a map, and that's Alberta.
yeah.
And it would probably take a year to find more precise. But speaking of the Nakota,
Yep.
everything was why. When one of the things I did was I had to watch the movies, because so much of what I was reading was reviews, which are subjective, studio publicity, which are full of nonsense sometimes. And I really had to watch the movies to understand what they were. And there was a 1938 movie with the Nakota in it.
Mm-hmm.
And well, as I watched the movies, I started realizing how many movies the Nakota were in. It was like, what is going on here? And the first one was shot on the reserve in 1917. Like how? So it was this 1938 movie. They used their language, and they actually used, the director was Milton Rosmer, the British director. And and it was actually one of the biggest A westerns of the 30s.
Mm,
There's a whole scene with the Dakota, and he's asking them what their names are, and their names are very fluid, and they're very descriptive. And working with the elders in the film project, they wanted me to include their names and their names at places,
yep.
and they would talk for 20 minutes about what the actual name meant. So in this movie, he gives them about 3 minutes to describe the name in Nakota. And I said, what is going on here? So it was like, why? That's the journalism. And then who how did they get onto the reserve? Who set them up? And I went to the Nakota, and it was, why were they in it? And they worked with them for about 6 months before they'd really trust me.
Mm-hmm.
And then it completely redirected my research. Was, well, how in heaven's name did they film a movie? Did Frank Borzaghi, who won the first Academy Award for directing in 1929, how did he get on the Morley Reserve in 1917?
Of all the places, yeah.
Of all the places.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you have the answer to that? Why? How did he end up on the reserve? Just
Well, the thing about Banff is that the people are very tacit, and they respect privacy. So they've had this magnificent history in film, and they've had very close relations with the directors, but
right.
none of that material has been spoken about or been made available. And it's just coming out now. They're starting to release all their photos to the archives, which is great fun.
Yeah, for sure.
Old family photos and it's anyway. So I approached a woman in Banff who was directly related to the Brewsters, and unfortunately she passed away before we could finish our interviews. But and I said, look, like who did this? My hunch is that it was Norm Luxton, who owned a cinema and a newspaper, and his father owned the Winnipeg Free Press.
Right.
And she confirmed. She said it's time the story was told, and this is 100 years later. That's how long they kept their mouths quiet.
Incredible.
So, yes, Norm Luxton was a beautiful ally, and he slammed a lot as a European entrepreneur, and who capitalized on the Nakota. And we had a big fight in the film project because an academic came in when I was speaking about him, and he was furious. And the Nakota came to me afterwards. The elder said he was a friend. And I said, can I say that? He was a friend. He, for 60 years, he was just a beautiful story. And he was out on the reserve when the Spanish flu happened. He'd written the government and said, look, they're dying. And the government said, yeah, it's on every reserve. Just let it run its course. And so he went out and nursed them. And he would post obituaries or stories about them. He asked people for help. He basically organized Indian days with the Brewsters so they could get off the reserves, and they weren't allowed to pay them, but they gave them food because they were being starved to death by our government. So he lived on the reserve around 1917, half the time. And he would have been the one that Frank Borzaghi would have approached. And he would have known him through his father's connections. These were very sophisticated people in Banff. And he also had that relationship with the Nakota that would have fostered that. So the elders also recognized their horses in the movie, and so, and they don't lie. So,
right.
They don't. So
I what I find interesting about your answer is it's a really good reminder of how film doesn't come out of a vacuum, right? Or most art doesn't come out of nowhere, right? It exists because of a wider system. In this case, a systemic issue that made it so the Nakota were on a reservation and allowed them to be in this film. And it's these types of things that a lot of film criticism needs to consider, and film history needs to consider, is what is the wider implication of why this particular movie got made, because it's more than just it was nice, right? And I think that answer really enlightens that part of film history that we tend to forget.
They weren't in the movie. They did say they watched it with me, and they recognized this scene where he's riding the horses. They are seeing the Mounties are riding the horses through the wilderness. One of the problems those early filmmakers had was they would come up here, and our Indigenous populations, our First Nations, were quote unquote less hostile than the American ones. Right. And they didn't recognize there's an Indigenous man and an Indigenous woman, and they didn't recognize the man. They think he was probably a California band or tribe. Right. But the woman, they said that their women they didn't recognize the concept of a housekeeper, and their women at that time would not have been comfortable being on film. But the Cree in Alberta might have. And then about 10 years later, a First Nation mentioned to me, thank you for doing the book, and thank you, because the Cree actually were involved in early filmmaking too. So right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but they had trouble when they went back to California. They had trouble getting actors who looked like the Nakota. So even in there was a Randolph Scott movie, and they wanted to fly 15 Elders back in 1948, and they wouldn't fly. They said only birds fly in the sky, but they could only find 4 Native American actors that could pass off as Nakota. So, interesting. Yeah, it's all been very fascinating.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. So I'm curious, getting into a bit more of the reasoning why Alberta was chosen, right? So today we think of Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal as when we think of film in Canada, right? Mostly from a visual effects perspective, right? Or a filming location perspective in big cities. Why was Alberta in particular such a draw for early film? Because it's not like mountains and other backdrops didn't exist in the United States. So why Alberta?
Even early on, before 1920, the Americans were saying their landscapes were depleted. Alberta was God's country. It was the far country. It was the land beyond. It was the great Northwest. It was the snowlands, and it was perpetuated in literature of the day. Oh yeah. The Nakota the Brewsters had taken William Twin to New York City on behalf of the CPR, I think in 1899, and they'd stayed there for 3 months. William Twin was in Nakota, and because the Americans wanted to see a grizzly, peaceable Indian, and a quote unquote, and a grizzly bear hunter who could speak English. So they were aware. Also, they started Banff Indian Days around that time. So that they could come off the reserve. It was a tourism spectacle, and there's a lot of criticism of it, but it was basically they came off the reserve. They weren't allowed off the reserve. Yep. And they got to practice their rituals. They had a teepee encampment outside town, and also they brought in other bands, who they were not allowed to talk to other bands in Alberta. And so one of the theories is that the Nakota were used to performing and pleasing, living up to expectations as the quote unquote noble savage.
Sure.
So there were a bunch of documentaries done in 1917, and that is probably why Frank Borzage came. They also came to Alberta because they seem to have very, very familiar relationships with a lot of the people in Banff. And Banff was iconic in terms of the landscapes. And there was a huge effort by the government and the CPR to promote tourism. They also had very fancy hotels that were many were used, the Canadian Pacific hotels were used for filming locations, but they were also very luxurious.
Mm.
And they knew they could come, and they spent a lot of time. They were very involved in the community. They had a lot of fun when they came here, and also they knew that their privacy would mostly be respected unless they wanted to promote the movie. The landscapes were legendary, the mountains were legendary, and there's nothing like the Rockies, Canadian Rockies anywhere else,
Yeah.
And they just they came for the realism, and they were the young hotshots who in 1916, when the studios began to formalize movies and start realizing how much money they could make. These were the guys who said, I'm not going to do half a day filming in a studio just to bang out these movies for you. We want realism. Realism drove everything.
Yeah.
And they didn't feel that the United States had the landscapes left for realism. And it actually kicked off an Alberta genre, the Northwest Miller, which is actually, the Revenant is a Northwest Miller. So 100 years later, it's still a powerful genre. So
absolutely. And we've been kind of you kind of alluded to this in your answer, so I'm going to touch upon this right now. But you were mentioning, right, this image of the prairies in general, but Alberta specifically, as being this place that's untouched by civilization, so to speak, right? Or that still, how could I say, like rough and tumble, in the sense you have to be able to survive in this place.
The
And
wilderness.
the wilderness.
Man
Exactly.
against nature.
Yeah.
Survival. Yeah.
And there's an interesting element in your book, which you touch upon, right? Is that despite this image that we have of the prairies as being this frontier in which you have to survive and all, there was a bit of controversy that emerged as American filmmaking and American movie making arrived in these frontier towns. Do you want to elaborate on what this controversy was a bit, and kind of why we find this both so funny?
Is that with the Estelle Taylor and the
Yes.
So in 1924, they came to film. Herbert Brennan was the director, and he brought Thomas Mahan, who was the biggest movie star of the day. Anna May Wong, who was a very tall, striking Asian woman, very, very famous. And there's some spectacular shots of her, both in the book and in the White Archives. And Estelle Taylor, who was a very beautiful woman. She was considered outspoken and untamable. So she went out and lived in the beach in Malibu to get away from everybody, because she just didn't do what they told her to. So she and Anna May Wong, there had been this grand announcement that they would be speaking. This movie, they interacted with the residents a lot, and they would be speaking at the Lux Theater, owned by Norman Luxton, on Monday evening. And it also speaks to the sophistication of the place. On the weekend, there was an article in the LA Times which kiboshed everything. And she had already, they were filming out at Silver City, out underneath Castle Mountain. It's an old ghost town. And they'd put her in an old shack for her makeup. And when she got there, there was a crazy chicken who didn't want to leave. So they spent 3 hours, 3 hours fighting with the chicken. And then they finally said, chicken and actor are going to share the makeup room. So she'd already ruffled the feathers of Banff fights. But when she got to the Lux Theater on Monday night, she and Anna May Wong walked down from the Banff Springs Hotel. It was a beautiful night. And they walked in, and she went up to speak on stage, and her latest movie was showing, and they booed her off the stage. So the Banff fights, Peter White is, the White Museum is named after Peter White. He
Mhm.
drove a lot of the stars around, and so I have a recollection from him where he was driving the director around to the public calming of the Banff fights. And they basically, Thomas Mahan, the movie idol, and the director went up on stage and said how lovely Banff was and how proud they were to be there. All Estelle Taylor had done. It was really cold. And I don't know if you know Alberta, but it snows in June here. It does.
Yeah.
And all she had said was she'd just sent a letter home to her friends saying that Alberta's was cold and the scenery was about as interesting as a drooping geranium in a back bedroom. And the Banff fights, they read the LA Times that weekend and they were outraged at the slanders on their
Right.
beautiful Banff. But that is a theme that has repeated all the way all through the century of American Arnold Schwarzenegger. He directly targeted Alberta when he was a governor, and 1924 they didn't want. They said too much filming was being done in Banff, and they needed them to stay back in California.
Yeah.
So
I shouldn't laugh because like it is a genuine issue, and I can understand from the Bamfites perspective of wanting to be recognized and wanting to get their due respect for having people use their backdrop, and this is what the place they call home. But at the same time it's just so incongruous with what I have in mind of the frontier life at the time, and I can't help but find that funny.
it's very there's pictures of Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Peckford and Douglas Fairbanks' mistress in another picture up there, carousing with the Banthites. And it was a very urbane, sophisticated wilderness. And they had a very different relationship with the Nakota. I mean, we know the brutal oppression that First Nations were subject to.
For sure.
But there was the Brewsters and Norm Luxton were golfing with the Nakota in the 20s and driving them around in they weren't called convertibles, but driving them around to movie sets. And it was a very different kind of relationship that they had. So they were still, So.
And before because we keep alluding to the Nakota and the Indigenous, I do have a few questions about that. But I have one last question about the filming industry in general before we get into that. And even to this day, we still often think of the United States as being the main driver of the film industry. Hollywood is still obviously a major powerhouse in that respect. But obviously Canada has its own industry, and I'm curious if during this time Canada's industry, like independent industry so to speak, grew as a result of the events that you describe in the book, or was it still mostly American-led movies that just went home afterwards, right? Because now we think of a Canadian industry, but back then I don't know.
No, and the Canadian government made a big mistake in the 1915 and 1920. They didn't solidify a national film policy, and they chose to regard filmmaking as propaganda for their tourism and settlement campaigns, so that they regarded that, the one thing, when I was doing research, I started reading Pierre Berton, and I immediately stopped because we weren't seeing the same thing. And what I discovered late in my research, just before the book was published, was that the Canadian government was specifying how these characters were portrayed in the movies. So all the Northwest Métis and the Mounties, a lot of times they had control of the script. And they promised access to our First Nations and our landscapes. Our bison herd was the last and large one in North America, and a lot of big directors came up to film that. John Ford. Ernest Shipman came to Calgary to make Canadian films, but he was offered. But at one point, they kind of thought maybe we better start setting a national policy that artistic content, development of an industry, and they asked him to handle a $10 million portfolio, and he turned it down because he believed in free enterprise and he bragged about it. So. And they never, all through the 20s, they had Raymond Peck, who was very good at promoting Canada, but he was it was almost propaganda. Right. And it repeated itself. The other thing was the industry in Banff was driven by private investors, and so was Calgary. And it was all about money. And, your movie, if you didn't get distribution by First National for a movie, and most of the directors who came to Canada or Alberta did, your movie was done. You
Right.
know, it would never leave the country. It would never receive wide recognition because by before 1920, they had, you know, set up cartels for the film industry and cemented it down. So, you know, the only really strong independent industry in Canada was Quebec. And I believe that started in the 30s, and that has fostered, that's why, you know, the Quebec movies are, their directors are prominent, their stories are prominent, their place, their character, their identity, their culture is very prevalent. And you know, we've been left with, uh, you know, it's a filming location. It's for the beauty of the landscapes, and also the after World War II, the money the Canadian government was offering them to come here. So.
Yeah. That's unfortunately something that you see rather as a recurring theme throughout the artistic life of Canada. And personally, I'm more I know more about the literary aspect, and you see exactly what you're describing happening over and over again in terms of these endeavors not being necessarily encouraged as much as they should, and often Canadian authors until maybe the 50s really, or the early 20th century, but needing to, you know, either be published in Britain or the United States, and always having to go outside of Canada in this case. And it's unfortunate that the same thing happened with movies for such a long time. Yeah.
It's never really good enough, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's going to get a lot of people, but it's always less than the American because there's not been an identity or a cultural
Mhm.
established. And it was, I have no idea why they kept feeding these Métis characters to the filmmakers. It's bizarre, but that's what they did. The Coeur de Bourgeois, you know.
Yeah, I'm not sure why Métis in particular, but it's interesting because this could be a good segue into actually talking more in depth about the Nakota, which we've been alluding to. But I remember reading a book by Daniel Francis, The Imaginary Indian, right? It's called, which is a really good overview of how Indigenous people have kind of been portrayed through media since really the beginning of Canada as a nation state as we imagine it. And he does touch upon occasionally movies and film in it. And it's interesting because he talks a little bit about what you've been saying insofar as Indigenous people who were portrayed in these movies were not necessarily done so accurately. They were done so in order to perpetuate stereotypes about Indigenous populations, right? But what's interesting about your book is that you kind of take a different approach, or you demonstrate a different approach for the Nakota. And I'm curious to hear you talk about this a little bit more. So if I were to put this in a more specific question, I mean, what was the initial impact of this filming industry on Indigenous populations in Alberta?
Um, the initial impact, the immediate impact was it gave them employment as their food rations. You know, they honored the treaties, and their
Sure.
food rations, particularly in Dakota, were squeezed, and I'm sure other bands as well, as their ability to hunt and gather was restricted, and within Dakota they were barred from the park, the national park. So the impact was it gave them employment. It got them off the reserve, which, you know, they were confined to very small tracts of land, and basically left with nothing to do of their original culture. It provided, you know, kind of non-union labor to the movie makers, but at that, in the early 20s, they were interested in the realism. So when Frank Borzage came in 1922, he filmed the Powder Face and the Powder Face, little Frank Powder Face, but John Hunter played his father. He's another chief, and Frank's father was John Powderface. Anyway, so he filmed a chief and a small little boy, 4-year-old, and his mother on a very traditional, their teepees were white. They were only decorated for tourism spectacles. So they originally were white. So he filmed a white teepee with drying racks and tanning racks, and the mother and the little boy in very traditional dress. And the mother does not look at the camera at all, which the elders told me would have been very appropriate. So the other thing is it allowed them to foster relationships with very important, empathetic people who understood what was happening to them. And there's always been a history of that, going after the quote unquote big man in the tribe, because that's who you speak to. And they learned that they're not a patriarchal society, but their women were the land keepers. They should have negotiated the treaties, but in a white patriarchal Christian society, the men rule, and the men's, they quickly realized that they had to adapt to what they wanted. As they said to me, they didn't ever want to make them mad because they didn't know what they'd do to them. The oppression would be crushing if they spoke at quote unquote out of turn. And anyway, so it did give them allies, and it's kind of complicated. Let me just, for example, that in 1923, what it did, it's
a complicated question.
It is complicated. In 1923, the Sampson Cree, who are quite, I'm quite impressed with them. They're all beautiful. But right. Thomas Ince came up to film a bison stampede, and he was really trying to take down Adolf Zucker, who was his nemesis. He'd put old Thomas Ince out of business a number of times and taken over his brilliant studios and run them to the ground. So they were going, pot boiler to pot boiler, and the Sampson Cree were hired, and they were going to ride alongside the bison. They were supposed to only stampede 1,000, but I think the numbers were about 10,000. Okay. And they were going to blunt their arrows, and they were going to have marksmen shoot them from the side. Well, Canadians found this out. Well, even around the world, it was a huge issue. And a Canadian politician said they can't shoot blunted arrows because they're not strong enough. They haven't shot for 20 years. Haven't had that way of life.
Right.
And so the government ordered them to stay on the reserve, and said they were under no circumstances allowed to take part in the film. And so it is interesting. So at some point, all of a sudden the Cree were in Wainwright, which is where the movie was filmed, and Thomas Ince and his brother were in Wainwright with the film crews, and the stampede happened with Cree involvement. And the government was absolutely outraged, and people were outraged afterwards. And the government, there were 4 or 5 weeks of blustering, and finally Thomas Ince stood up and said that, the First Nations, he called them Indians, but were mm-hmm. of no value to the picture other than scenic or color. They did not participate in the slaughter of the animal. But the Cree also hosted a barbecue and prepared the bison meat for the filmmakers. And they actually took some of it back to California for their friends. And for me, it was a really interesting way that they were actually allowed to be themselves and not, and to interact. I mean, to interact as human beings, not as these oppressed people on the reserve, but they actually, and I think that is one of the most impactful things probably filmmaking did, was that they treated them like human beings, and they had barbecues together, and Frank Borzage camped with them, so. Right.
And to this day, because you mentioned having spoken with Nakota people, and I'm curious, do they still feel like this was ultimately a good thing to be able to preserve certain ways of life through film, or has this is this not necessarily something that's thought about anymore?
Well, they have an oral history. So I worked with 10 elders, and unfortunately my two most elders who know the most history from that time have passed away. But their great chiefs were involved in filmmaking. And if the great chiefs were involved, and they do tell me that great chief is our concept because their leadership was not set up the way we envisioned it. But that would mean that everybody would be involved. And when they made that movie, The Alaskan, there were 350, I think, Nakota involved in it, including children. So that's, and they were all paid, and they were all fed, and they all camped at the site. But so one of the things we're starting to discover, and doing this work with the elders, it's been going on about 6 years. It's, watching their culture be eradicated in 100 years. It broke my heart, and it was very hard on them to go back and see little Frank Powderface, who was adorable. And Frank Borzage loved him, and he gave him a credit, and he taught him to say hi mucky muck anytime he saw a white guy. I know there's so many pictures, but so what was I saying? Anytime how did I get off on that one?
So anytime that just go ahead.
So it turns out that what we're starting to see, it was working with the elders. We didn't get a lot of it covered. I mean, so much. They just started talking about racism and segregation on modern day sets, and we didn't really touch on women because that's a horrible topic, the sexualization of their women. But one of the things we did discover is that the incident I spoke where they allowed it was John Hunter again to say the name in the long version with the many descriptions.
Yeah.
And then in 1954 with Raoul Walsh, who was a rascal and I adore him, when he filmed a scene with Alan Ladd as a Mountie up at Bow Lake, which is beautiful, through the woods you can hear the Nakota chanting, and one of their great chiefs, Walking Buffalo, you can hear him hollering out in Nakota, and they just burst out laughing when he came on screen. He's saying, "Don't laugh, the camera's rolling." But what they were singing, and this, the elders, it took a long time for them to give me that information. But what they were singing was the battle song that they sang when they signed the treaty. They surrounded the cabin wherever they were because they knew they were being lied to. And they had already been deceived because one of their chiefs was away. And somebody signed on his behalf who was not supposed to. So for some reason, Raoul Welsh let them sing that battle song, which is remarkable. I would have loved to have been there. But what we discover is that these are messages to the future. And there's probably many more that the Nakota put in those movies. And it's probably going to take a 5-year study because it's not really our business. It's their business. Their messages to them, right? And for them, he didn't, we don't, but the fact that they're there is very important, I think, it's really exciting to hopefully maybe be able to work with the elders and pass that on to their children. So.
And there's also, we have to contend that probably there's some lost films that might have featured some footage that we can never retrieve again, just because film was not preserved as well as it is today. So
it was preserved in Russia. They have a copy of every film, and they were gifting them to the Library of Congress 10 a year, including one shot in Alberta by Reginald Barker, which I wasn't allowed to see. The studios locked it up, but I went to the Library of Congress and watched it. And they had a person stand beside me so that I didn't record any of it. But anyway, Russia did keep every movie ever shown there. So, yeah.
Of all places, I never would have expected.
But the Americans, they did not keep the films. I don't know, and here it's pretty hard to get those films.
Yeah, from what I've understood, also a lot of the film was just because it deteriorated over time, and it's not because the film was not considered interesting. It was just sometimes there were just accidents, and it was either light exposure or something like that or a lack of film, and so you had to kind of use other means. So I don't, from what I've understood, it was mostly just human error that caused a lot of these films to be lost, but I really don't know. Although speaking of, I'm sorry,
that's another book.
Oh, honestly, I would read the hell out of that.
Yeah, I
know. But speaking of standing the test of time, so obviously you talk a lot about natural landscapes in your movie, in your book, but you also talk about cabins and physical areas that were constructed. And I'm curious how all these different locations have kind of stood the test of time, right? Is there any kind of preservation effort on the part of Alberta or Canada's government to maintain these as culturally important sites, or have these kind of withered away and are no longer recognized today?
Most of them don't exist. It was really interesting. The Ernest Lubitsch movie, I had Chick Scott, who's a very famous mountaineer, and he actually worked for Clint Eastwood on the Geiger sanction as the mountain consultant. But we were watching, I think it was another Frank Borzage movie, Valley of the Sun. No, it was the Ernest Lubitsch movie, sorry, with John Barrymore, shot in 1929. And he was talking about how he could tell what was real snow and fake snow, and also the time of year because of the shadows and the way it was. But there was a tea house, and they did go back. Lubitsch recreated the Austrian Swiss village back in California. And there was a mountain tea house. There's tea houses all up through the mountains and the hiking trails. And Chick said, there's just it looks authentic. Like it looks like the snow in front of it is fake, but it looks authentic. And I think it was just torn down last year, but that would,
Mm.
the fort for Saskatchewan, which Alan Ladd Walsh, that was they bickered about what to do with that. The government, the film company left it for the people of Banff National Park, and it fell into ruin. Billy Wilder left an island for Jasper, and he left a barn, and the it became a pony barn, quite fondly remembered by the locals. But he left an island that he had made so that Bing Crosby and Joan Fontaine could take this Viennese boat that he brought in out to the island and have a kiss. And then they were having a ceremony to hand the island over to Jasper, and the thing sank. They had a band on there, and they had probably 20 people. So I have a shot in the book of the rowboats going out to get everybody off this fake island sinking.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not much remains of. Yeah. So
Okay. That's rather unfortunate. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably more modern day. Anyway, it's interesting because I'm still researching modern day, but there may be more, more landmarks left in modern day, but
We don't know yet.
we don't know
We'll
yet.
have to wait for book 2.
Yeah.
But speaking of which, so you stopped this book in 1960, right? And I'm curious if there was a reason for this. Did the kind of industry start to trail off, or was there a shift that you perceived in the movie industry in Canada or in Alberta that you felt that it was a natural stopping point? I'm purely curious as to why 1960.
The old guard, Norman Loxton died in 1962. Now he had set up John Ford in 1956 or 50 when he filmed The Searchers.
Yeah, it would have, if Searchers came out in 56, 57, so probably a year or two before, I think.
Yeah, and he was the government liaison with the Bison Stampede, and he had been since 1923 and probably before that. A lot of the Brewsters had died, and their sons and their nephews had taken over. Hollywood changed because one of the big problems in Alberta and probably Canada was sometimes the weather. There's talk of one filmmaker bringing in a Nakota rain dancer, which the Nakotas say they've never met this man, but this was in 1946, I think, to change the weather for them. But the weather was unpredictable. Some directors absolutely loved it, some didn't. So so Hollywood had changed a little bit, and they were filming more in Europe for the epics. And around 1960, and this has been very hard to get to, and the only way I found it was one interview with a Brewster cousin in the small Craig Canyon, just to mention. Parks Canada changed its policies around 1960 in response to the conservation movement, and basically they decided that filmmaking wasn't appropriate for national parks, anything that was quote unquote detrimental to the land and the playground of the people. So they really discouraged, and I'm not sure if it was just Banff. It's very, very hard to get any information on this. I've asked two park superintendents. It's the only information I did find was that Brewster relative saying, yeah, it basically ended when Parks Canada kicked out the filmmakers. So
Which
that
I can
was
understand, but it's still, a bit disappointing.
It's still, but they didn't really, there wasn't much damage to the landscape, but not like the skywalk in Jasper that Harper created, that he nailed into the stone, but permanent. Anyway, so that it was just a combination of things, and so there really was a sea change in 1960. It was really interesting because the young Albertans there were 4 big movies made in 1954, and there was sort of a film unit for the Alberta government, and all of these guys really developed themselves on these big films, and so they wanted to make their own films, and it really was the start of the independent industry. And also the focus for 60 years had primarily been Banff, not all of it. There were definitely many beautiful prairie, and they did film all over the province. It's shocking. Athabasca's way up north. But the focus had primarily been the national parks because they were the iconic landscapes. So it really did open up different landscapes and in Alberta to the film industry. And it's in 1960s there were, Dr. Zhivago, Stanley Kubrick was in Calgary for a month setting up a shot for Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah, interesting.
And Disney had a studio in Calgary in the 60s. So he had one of his cinematographers had a wild game farm with tigers on the Morley Reserve and a studio. That's been fun to learn about. So it just the whole focus shifted from mountain to the broader province, the Badlands around Drumheller,
For sure.
the prairies, and I mean, when I was in the Oscar archives last week, and they were just crushing on Brad Pitt in the field for the assassination of Jesse James, that iconic shot.
Yeah, okay.
And so that's how it changed. It did kind of dwindle in the 60s, but there was a lot of people busy making independent films, there was government support when Peter Lougheed came in, so it started to surge again, and then it fell off again. So it's been up and down, up and down, and up and down, and that's where Vancouver and Toronto have been able to come in and fill in the gaps around the 80s or 90s. They don't have the history we do, and I'll probably get run out of the country for saying that.
I think that's a justified statement. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's and you don't. I don't remember where many of the films were shot that are shot in BC and Ontario. I don't remember the locations, but in Alberta, the locations are iconic. So
the only whenever I notice filming locations is when it happens in downtown Montreal and they pretend that it's like New York or France instead, and that always makes me laugh.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love that creativity, though. It's amazing what they can do. Yeah.
The one that I remember most is, I think it was in John Wick 2 or something like that, some action movie, and they were supposedly driving down some New York main street. I was like, oh no, I pass by there all the time. That's right beside the university I go to.
Yeah, not New York. Yeah.
So you've alluded to this a little bit, that you've been working on a second book. Would you like to tell us a bit about what that is? Is this a continuation of this first book, or is it a bit of a different?
No, sorry. It starts around 1960, and the first independent movie was gobbled up. It was about a goose that saves the pilot in the wilderness, and it was gobbled up, I think, by Paramount, and it made $9 million. So, and then the guy did one on Doukhobors with dancing naked women, the next movie. But it starts up around 1960 where it left off. And what shocked me was the continuation, as I said before, with Terrence Malick and Dr. Zhivago, the connections between the directors and the themes and the styles and the filming locations, that modern directors use that are I need more research on this, but appear to be an homage to those early pioneers who came, and that really shocked me, because that more than anything showed me how important the industry was. This is a director's province. Like, it's after 1960, the directors who came here and made movies, and they're all, it's Interstellar, Inception, Clint Eastwood, Terrence Malick, Little Big Man, Buffalo Bill and the Indians, Arthur Penn with, it's just been
not small names, to say the least.
No. Yeah. And they're all coming for the realism. They're coming for the light, the cinematic light. I may have missed that, this big one. The cinematic light in Alberta, and at Morley, it's particularly exquisite. And I don't know, it's not northern, not southern. And Morley's kind of, the Nakota Reserve is kind of in a bowl. But whatever it is, it works. And they love filming there. So
interesting. And before we finish this, there's always a question that I like to ask people that I talk to. And what didn't I ask? And what's the answer to that question?
Oh, you did pretty good. You did pretty well.
Yes.
Yes. I don't really think there's I thank you. I loved your questions. I thought it was really good. So
I'm glad to hear it. So Mary, where can people know more about your work?
It's called A Stunning Backdrop, A Century in Alberta. Alberta in the Movies, 1917 to 1960. It's on Amazon. It's starting to be available at bookstores. Right now it's going around the world. It's in Australia, India, Denmark, Sweden, Japan, Korea, South America. We'll see.
Wow.
But it'll be in bookstores, I guess, October 30th or 31st. It's actually supposed to arrive today, so I'm really shocked that I was able to speak to you coherently, because it's like 12 years worth of work.
Wow, 12
Yeah,
years.
12
Good
years.
Lord.
Yeah.
That makes it all the more impressive, honestly. And
Oh, it's been a total pleasure. It's been so much fun. I mean,
I'm
I'm
sure,
really lucky to have that. So,
I'm
yeah.
sure.
And I've been my own boss all the way. So
That is undoubtedly the best part. Yes.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Mary, thank you very much for joining me today. And yeah, go check out her Mary's book. It is really good. I really enjoyed
Oh,
it. And it's a part of Canada's history that we don't talk enough about. So yeah, check it out.
oh, thank you very much.
All right. Have a nice day.
Okay, you too. Bye.